Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a really big topic, the true cost, you could say, of convenience and flavor in the modern world. Our mission is to trace the origins of the standard global diet, but we're looking beyond just, the nutrition labels. We're diving deep into the history, the economics, the forces that took three ingredients we see everywhere, salt, sugar, and fat, and basically made them the core of this industrial food system that shapes what you eat every single day.
That's such a critical point because when you try to figure out why our food environment looks the way it does, why processed foods dominate, people often jump to the chemistry,
The bliss point, right?
the neurological hook. Exactly. And while that chemistry is absolutely fascinating, the sources we're looking at today really push us to look beyond the lab. We need to look at the history books, the trade routes, even the corporate boardrooms. We really have to grasp how global trade, how empire, how industrial economics took sugar and salt, which were once, believe it or not, exotic, expensive items, and turned them into these fundamental dirt cheap necessities, and doing that completely redefined geography, labor systems, and maybe most importantly for our discussion, what consumers like you even expect food to taste like.
Okay, so the mission is historical and economic, fundamentally.
Yeah.
We're tracing sugar and salt from, like, status symbols, imperial projects, all the way to industrial inputs. And then we'll look at how massive corporate scale, logistics, and cheap fat sort of recalibrated everything. Not just what's on our plate, but how we judge taste and affordability. Let's get into it. Starting with sugar. Its story is maybe the most transformative globally, and well, definitely the most violent.
Yeah, sugar is ground zero. When we talk about the foundation of this modern food system, we really have to start with what historians sometimes call the era of globalization. Now, obviously, long-distance trade existed for millennia, but what kicked off in the late 15th century, that was something, well, fundamentally new. It was this rapid, permanent, and often incredibly disruptive worldwide exchange. Goods, people, diseases, crops. Everything started moving in a way it never had before. And sugar. Sugar was the engine driving so much of it.
It's amazing how one specific action can just set the stage for centuries. And the sources pinpoint this moment quite clearly, don't they? The start of industrial-scale sugar production ties directly back to Christopher Columbus. Think about this. His second voyage, 1493. He wasn't just bringing soldiers and settlers. He brought an agricultural blueprint. He literally transported sugarcane cuttings from the Canary Islands to the New World.
And it wasn't accidental. He wasn't just planting things randomly. His own journals show this was a very deliberate strategic economic move. He looked at the Caribbean islands and basically said, yes, this place is ideal for growing sugar. He knew what he was looking for. And when he established that first permanent settlement, La Isabela, that wasn't just about Spain gaining a foothold, it cemented sugar's role. It became the crucial, incredibly profitable commodity that would fuel this new global exchange for, well, centuries.
But that economic engine, that transformation, it ran on human lives. The sheer amount of labor needed for sugarcane planting, the backbreaking harvest, the dangerous processing, demanded a massive, controllable workforce. Which brings us, inevitably, to slavery.
The explosion of sugar production after 1492 created this insatiable demand for labor that the European colonists couldn't or wouldn't provide themselves, their first attempts, trying to enslave the indigenous populations already there. But that largely failed, mostly because these populations had no immunity to old world diseases like smallpox. They just died in horrifying numbers.
A demographic catastrophe.
Absolutely. And it was then that the colonists turned their focus, tragically decisively, towards Africa.
The scale is just. It's hard to comprehend. When we talk about building this global food architecture, we have to be honest that it was built on immense violence. Over 4 centuries, the estimates are around 11 million enslaved Africans transported to the New World. 11 million.
And even that number, horrifying as it is, it hides so much of the suffering. The sources we're looking at, they document this. They suggest that maybe as many as half of the people captured in the African interior died before they even reached the coast.
Before the Middle Passage even began.
Exactly. Died on the forced marches in holding pens. The system of sugar plantations, which just exploded in the 17th century as the British, the French, the Dutch all raced to get their own sugar colonies. That system was a central driving force behind this horrific trade, indispensable to it.
It's staggering that the economic value of, well, a sweetener could be used to justify that level of brutality. And if we connect this back, sugar itself was transformed by this process, wasn't it?
Completely. It started as this luxury spice, almost like medicine sometimes. A sumptuary article is the term used. Something only the absolute wealthiest elites, say in Spain or Portugal, could afford. But through this brutal system of production, it became this incredibly cheap, high-energy calorie source. It literally fueled the workers in the new factories, the soldiers, the sailors. It powered this massive new global system of labor and commerce.
That transformation of status is so important. Cheap sugar becomes essential fuel for the industrializing economy. But what drove the demand for all this now cheap sugar? It wasn't just people wanting, like, candy, right?
No, not primarily. A huge part of the demand came because sugar was incredibly useful for masking bitterness or just generally improving the palatability of other new global products that were sweeping across Europe at the same time.
Like tea and coffee.
Exactly. Think about the daily drinks before then. Often it was weak beer, small beer, or maybe wine. These were fermented, safer than potentially contaminated water. But then coffee arrives in Europe, 17th century mainly, and tea follows. They offered something new, a safe drink, because you use boiled water, but also a stimulant.
So a different kind of fuel for the workday.
Precisely. People drinking coffee or tea instead of small beer were alert, focused, maybe better workers in the burgeoning factories, right? This wasn't just a cultural shift. It created this massive, sustained global hunger for sweeteners to make these bitter drinks palatable. Chocolate, too, later on. The industrial production of sugar had to scale up to meet this demand, feeding this new caffeinated global economy.
And you see this deliberate use of sugar to make products work, chemically and commercially even much later. The Coca-Cola example is pretty striking.
Oh, it's a perfect case study. John Pemberton creates Coke right when the temperance movement is huge in the U.S. He needs a non-alcoholic alternative, a temperance drink. So he tinkers with his formula, and a key move is using a lot of sugar to deliberately cover up the natural bitterness of the coca leaf and the cola nut.
He wasn't aiming for a global beverage initially, was he?
Not at all. His idea was it would be a medicinal flavoring dispensed at soda fountains. But sugar was the key. It made it palatable, it made it shelf-stable when mixed with carbonated water, and ultimately it made it addictive and globally dominant. Sugar was the chemical and the economic unlock.
And the cultural impact was immediate, almost controversial from the start. That term Coca-colonization, that popped up pretty early, didn't it?
Yeah, late 1940s, early 50s, especially in places like France, you had, communist sympathizers and others campaigning really hard against Coke, setting up bottling plants there. They argued it would kill off traditional French industries like wine or mineral water. They were so against it, they actually tried to get Coca-Cola banned, claiming it was literally poisonous.
Wow, so it became more than just a drink.
Oh, absolutely. It became this potent symbol, a really visible, easy target for resentment about America's growing power after the war, especially with things like the Marshall Plan, which critics were calling, imperialism by other means.
And yet, despite protests, I think the sources mention actual Coke trucks being overturned. The expansion just continued.
It did. And ironically, all that controversy probably generated tons of free publicity worldwide. It just proved that this combination of, strategic sugar use, clever marketing, and efficient logistics was basically unstoppable.
Okay, so sugar's story is deeply tangled with empire, with slavery, with the deliberate shaping of a global palate. We see the pattern. Find a key commodity, figure out how to produce it on a massive, often violent scale, and then use it to make other products palatable and profitable. Let's pivot now to the second ingredient in our triad, salt. Its story is different, maybe even older, predating these big global empires. Salt is fascinating, isn't it? Because unlike sugar, which went from this luxury item to a cheap staple because of the colonial system, salt has always been a non-negotiable necessity for human survival. It's like this strategic pillar holding up our historic food systems. Its economic importance literally shaped where cities grew, where trade routes ran, even where wars were fought.
It's utterly indispensable. We tend to think of sodium now mainly as, a flavor enhancer, part of that SFS combination that makes processed foods so appealing. But historically, its role in preservation was everything. Long before refrigeration, salt was how you kept meat and fish from spoiling. This stability was crucial for feeding armies on the move, for enabling long sea voyages, and maybe most critically, for feeding large populations in cities who weren't growing their own food. Salt made urbanization possible on a larger scale.
The sources give some really vivid examples of just how long this has been central. Salt preservation goes way back. The Romans, apparently, used a lot of salt for things like hams and other pork products.
That's right, and it seems they actually picked up some sophisticated techniques from the Celts before them. The whole method of dry salting pork, then maybe smoking it, like the famous hams from Westphalia that goes back to Roman times. It shows how deeply embedded salt was in, you could call it, early food engineering.
And it just continued right through the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
especially for fish, right? Fish became a huge dietary staple, partly because of religious rules, like Lent.
Absolutely. And we have these incredibly specific recipes, some dating back to the late 1300s, telling people exactly how to do it. One recipe details how to prepare whiting, that's a relative of cod, letting it die in coarse salt for 3 days. Another explains how to boil and then broil a salted eel. Without refrigerators, these dry salting methods were basically the only way to guarantee a protein supply through the winter or during long periods when fresh food wasn't available.
So because it was so vital, so universally needed, controlling the salt supply wasn't just about market economics. It became a matter of national strategy, like justifying military action.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really powerful point in the sources. You look at the 17th and 18th centuries, the age of intense European colonial rivalry. They weren't just fighting tooth and nail over the lucrative sugar islands in the Caribbean. They were fighting just as hard over seemingly barren islands that happened to have good natural salt pans or inland salt marshes, places like the Cape Verde Islands. Salt was absolutely seen as a strategic military asset, as valuable as gunpowder in some ways.
There's that amazing story about the Dutch, isn't there, during their long war for independence from Spain.
Yes. The 80 Years' War, starting way back in 1568. The conflict completely cut the Dutch off from their traditional salt supplies in Spain and Portugal, and this was disastrous for them, especially for their huge herring fishing fleets, which relied on salt for preservation.
So what happens when a major European power loses access to its most basic strategic commodity?
Well, they get creative, or desperate. The Dutch basically resorted to state-sponsored piracy, driven by necessity. Their ships would sail all the way across the Atlantic to the coast of Venezuela, to this remote, desolate peninsula called Araya. It's basically a natural salt factory, a huge lagoon where Caribbean seawater evaporates under the hot sun, leaving behind massive salt deposits.
And they just took it.
Pretty much, they literally land at night and just steal the Spanish salt right off the beach. It sounds almost comical, but it shows how incredibly critical access to salt was for the survival and the economic functioning of a major 17th century power.
Okay, so salt shapes geography, trade, military strategy. Now let's fast forward industrial age. How does salt production change? It's less about pirates sneaking onto beaches, presumably.
Right. It becomes less about capturing specific strategic locations and more about achieving absolutely massive volume at the lowest possible cost. And the way they often achieve that is through these enormous evaporation ponds, usually in hot, dry coastal areas.
The scale must be completely different.
Oh, incomparably different from that little lagoon in Venezuela. Take a place like Sfax in Tunisia, as a modern example cited in the sources. A single industrial salt works there can cover thousands of acres with these shallow ponds. They produce something like 300,000 metric tons of salt per year. The technology is ancient sun and wind doing the work, but the scale and the logistics are purely industrial. Profitability depends entirely on producing these vast quantities and shipping them super cheaply around the globe.
And this flood of cheap, readily available sodium chloride. It becomes the absolute backbone of early industrial food processing, right? And, maybe more worryingly, a key ingredient in making things seem safe or fresh, even when they might be. Less than ideal.
Exactly. You look at the work of someone like Dr. Harvey W. Wiley. He was the crusading chemist at the turn of the 20th century, often called the father of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. He did these crucial investigations, particularly into the food being supplied to the Army, and his team found some pretty disturbing things about the meat supplies. Meat packers were relying heavily on sodium chloride, just cheap table salt, but often combined with potassium nitrate. That's more commonly known as saltpeter.
Saltpeter.
Yeah.
Not an ingredient in gunpowder. That sounds not great for food.
It does sound alarming, doesn't it? But it points to the priorities. Shelf stability and cost above all else. Saltpeter had actually been used since the Middle Ages as a preservative. It stops decay. And conveniently for the producers, it also gives cured meats that appealing reddish-pink color, masking the natural graying that happens as meat ages or decays. So in the industrial era, this cheap salt and saltpeter combo was perfect. It stabilized the meat, made it look good, and made large-scale, shelf-stable industrial food production possible, which was essential for feeding not just armies, but the rapidly growing cities too. It really confirms salt's role as this essential, inexpensive fixer in the mass production food system.
Okay, so we've got sugar, driven by empire, and the need for cheap calories and palatability. We've got salt, always essential, but industrialized for preservation and cost. But this whole system couldn't reach its current, global saturation without the third piece of the puzzle, fat. and, critically, the hyper-efficient logistics that deliver it all.
Right. Now we bring in the third player, fat, and connect it to the vast economic infrastructure that allows this SFS triad, salt, fat, sugar, to become so overwhelmingly palatable, so cheap and just everywhere. Fat is the element that really binds flavor and texture together in ways that fundamentally change our expectations of what food should feel and taste like.
It's definitely more than just calories, isn't it? It's about flavor, it's about that richness, that mouthfeel, that satisfying quality that makes something feel indulgent or truly appealing. Our biology seems wired for it.
It is, and it fundamentally alters the eating experience, especially when you're talking about processed foods where natural structures might be lost. So think about frying, for instance. You need fats or oils because they can get much, much hotter than water. And that intense heat is what triggers the Maillard reaction, that amazing chemical dance between proteins and sugars. It's responsible for almost all those deep, savory, browned flavors and textures we find irresistible. You know, the crust on good bread, the outside of a perfect French fry. Fat is the essential medium to achieve that flavor impact quickly and cheaply in industrial settings.
You could even see the appreciation for fat's role changing high-end cooking centuries ago. The sources mentioned this shift in, 18th century Britain.
British aristocrats started consciously moving away from what they saw as the old, heavy, spicy medieval ways of cooking. They wanted something lighter, fresher, and notably more buttery. This reflected the growing influence of French Nouvelle Cuisine, which was all about fresh ingredients, but crucially relied heavily on fats, butter, high-quality oils to deliver that sophisticated, appealing taste. Fat was central even then.
Okay, so you have the inherent appeal of fat, the chemistry it enables. Now, combine that engineered palatability with just enormous scale and logistical efficiency. That's how we get the commodity giants, right? The companies that ensure SFS are the cheapest, most available calories on the planet.
Absolutely. The industrial scale we see today, it was really built on the back of incredibly cheap commodity crops, primarily corn and soy, heavily subsidized in many countries, especially the U.S. This cheap feedstock allowed corporations like, Cargill is the prime example given in the sources. It allowed them to realize this vision of an endless belt, controlling production, processing, transportation, everything.
Cargill,
Yeah.
they're huge, but maybe not a household name in the way some other brands are.
Exactly. They operate this massive global empire, reportedly from a somewhat nondescript, huge office complex outside Minneapolis. But the sources argue they're arguably the most powerful private corporation in modern history. The analysis doesn't mince words. One comparison is to Standard Oil in the early 20th century, dominant, controlling a vital resource.
Wow.
But then the critique goes even further. It suggests better analogy might actually be the British Empire in the 19th century.
The British Empire. That's a huge claim. What's the logic there?
It's about the scope of control. The British Empire controlled the seas, the trade routes, the colonies, the raw materials, the logistics, everything needed to move its key commodities, like tea and sugar, around the world for profit. Cargill, the argument goes, does something similar for the modern food system. They don't just trade grain. They own the silos, the barges, the ships, the rail cars, the crushing plants that turn soy and corn into oils and sweeteners. And crucially, they influence the government policies, like subsidies, that make those inputs, the corn, the soy, the fats, the sugars, overwhelmingly cheap. They essentially control the global architecture of cheap calories.
And this relentless drive for volume, for efficiency, it has casualties, right? It forces this intensification across all of agriculture, often pushing smaller producers out. The dairy example is quite stark.
It really is. The sources describe how, on modernizing dairy farms, once a farm got above a certain size, maybe around 200 cows, the simple logistics of letting them graze outside became impractical. They'd churn up the pastures too much, their movement wasn't efficient for milking. It just didn't fit the volume-driven model.
So it was deemed more efficient to just keep them indoors all the time.
Yes. Keep them confined, bring the feed to them, often feed grown using those cheap subsidized commodity grains. The farmer could maximize milk volume per cow per square foot that way.
But it wasn't really a choice for many farmers, was it? It was economic pressure.
Completely. It was sheer survival. Because this massive volume of milk produced using this industrialized, subsidized feed system was flooding the market. Supermarkets were using milk as a loss leader in price wars. The sources note that the price farmers receive for milk actually fell below the price of bottled water at one point.
It's unbelievable.
It is. So farmers felt they had absolutely no choice but to intensify, to squeeze more volume out, often sacrificing animal welfare or traditional practices just to break even.
It feels like a cycle where policy decisions, those big subsidies for corn and soy, inevitably favor the huge players, the Cargills, and make it almost impossible for smaller, maybe more diverse or sustainable farms to compete.
That's exactly the dynamic described. The system inherently crowds out independent operations. And sometimes, quite cynically, the infrastructure that drives this consolidation is even funded by the smaller players it ends up destroying.
How does that work?
The example given is the pork checkoff programs in the U.S. These are mandatory fees paid by all hog farmers, supposedly to fund industry-wide promotion and research. But the analysis suggests these checkoff funds were often strategically used to promote the industrial model of hog production large-scale confinement operations. The very model that, according to the sources, drove nearly 250,000 independent family hog farms out of business within about 12 years of the program starting.
So the small guys were basically forced to pay for the advertising and R&D that helped the big guys put them out of business.
That's the argument presented. It's the independent producers funding the system that ultimately displaces them.
And this pattern of industrial dominance, favoring scale and using financial muscle, it extends right down to the retail level, doesn't it? Affecting Main Street businesses.
Oh, absolutely. Walmart is presented as the classic example of this retail industrialization. The company leverages its immense size and balance sheet to systematically undercut local businesses. They can afford to lose money in a specific store or on specific products for a time, specifically to drive out competition, something a smaller local store just can't sustain. Sam Walton himself might have genuinely believed he was helping by offering low prices, but the ripple effects, sources argue, were often devastating for local economies.
Is there data on that?
Yes, the sources cite some specific studies. For instance, one looked at Iowa. Within 10 years of Walmart opening nearly 100 stores across the state, Iowa lost huge numbers of small businesses. We're talking almost 300 hardware stores gone, nearly 300 building supply stores, over 150 variety stores, 150 shoe stores, more than 100 local drugstores, vanished. The impact was heaviest in the smaller towns. It shows how this drive for industrial efficiency doesn't just change shopping habits, it fundamentally reshapes the economic fabric of entire communities.
Okay, so this whole system, designed for massive volume, driven by subsidies, perfected by logistics, it all culminates in delivering cheap, incredibly palatable food, rich in SFS, to the maximum number of people, often masking some pretty profound social and environmental costs along the way. And this leads us directly to the impact on our health, our diet, and the ethical questions that arise. So this industrial food architecture, built on cheap salt, sugar, and fat, delivered efficiently by these corporate giants. It hasn't just changed what's available, it's profoundly recalibrated the human diet itself. It's led us into what the sources call the age of nutritionism.
That term nutritionism is really key. It's described as this dominant ideology or way of thinking that shifts our focus away from actual foods, apples, broccoli, fish, and towards isolated, invisible nutrients. So instead of thinking about eating a balanced meal with whole ingredients, we're encouraged to think about grams of fat, milligrams of sodium, added vitamins, fiber content.
And why is that framework so convenient for the industrial food system?
Well, because it naturally benefits processed, manufactured foods over whole foods. It's much easier and usually more profitable for a company to, say, strip down a grain, refine it, maybe add back some synthetic vitamins or fiber, and then market it as healthy based on those isolated nutrients.
Right, easier than just selling the original whole grain.
Exactly. This nutritionism mindset makes it seem perfectly logical to consume highly engineered products that might be low in fat but loaded with refined sugar, or fortified with vitamin C but otherwise nutritionally poor. It promotes the creation and sale of these high-profit engineered foods, which almost inevitably rely heavily on that SFS triad to make them taste good once the natural complexity is gone.
And the health consequences of this shift seem pretty clear. We're seeing this explosion of what people often call diseases of civilization.
Yeah. Yes. Things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, these were much, much less common a century ago. And they're still relatively rare in populations around the world that haven't adopted this Western industrial diet, which is so dominated by processed foods stripped of their natural nutrients and loaded with SFS.
The sources even suggest this industrial logic kind of infiltrates the scientific advice we get about diet. There was that controversy around fat recommendations.
It's a telling example. When scientific committees in the U.S. decades ago were looking at the links between diet and disease, some early evidence pointed towards high fat consumption, particularly saturated fat, being linked to things like cancer. The initial proposals suggested maybe reducing fat intake from around 40% of calories down towards 30%. But even that faced huge internal resistance.
Resistance based on
Economics and politics, essentially. According to the accounts, a key figure on the committee, who also directed a USDA nutrition lab, basically warned his colleagues that pushing the recommendation below 30% fat would be politically impossible. Why? Because it would mean people would have to eat significantly less animal products, less meat, less dairy. And he reportedly said recommending that would be the death of the report because of the powerful lobbying influence of the meat and dairy industries, which are deeply tied into that subsidized grain system we talked about.
So, the structure of industrial agriculture, built on cheap feed driving high-volume animal production, effectively put a cap on how low the official healthy fat recommendation could go. It protected the economic interests of the big suppliers.
That's the interpretation offered. It suggests that the prevailing economic system influenced what was presented as optimal dietary science. And it really underscores the argument for shifting focus back to whole foods.
Because whole foods offer something that fortification can't replicate.
Exactly. The industrial approach tries to fix the problems it creates by adding back isolated nutrients. Multivitamins are the perfect example. The sources describe them almost as a clunky, crude substitute for the incredible complexity found in real food. Think about, say, a single head of broccoli. It doesn't just contain vitamin C and fiber. It contains literally thousands of different phytochemicals, enzymes, antioxidants, cofactors, interacting in ways we barely understand. Many haven't even been properly studied or named yet.
You can't put that in a pill.
You really can't. And the sources make a provocative point. Maybe we should view multivitamins less as a health supplement and more as emergency medication for lifestyle-induced malnutrition. It's a stark framing, suggesting that because so many people rely so heavily on processed foods lacking this natural complexity, a huge portion of the adult population in modern societies could be considered, by some medical standards, medically compromised due to this fundamental failure of the industrial food system to provide adequate whole nutrition.
That systemic failure leads directly into the ethical questions, doesn't it? The need for change, for accountability.
It does. The industrial model seems to thrive on this kind of disconnect. The consumer is often shielded from, or chooses to ignore, the realities of production, the environmental costs, the labor issues, the animal welfare concerns. And the producer, incentivized purely by volume and profit, becomes focused only on efficiency, often leading to what the writer Wendell Berry calls institutionalized waste. Waste of topsoil, water, energy, human skill.
And Barry's point is that the consumer isn't really innocent in this, right? Even if we don't know all the details.
Right. He argues that by simply choosing the cheapest, most convenient option on the shelf without asking questions, the consumer becomes a participant, innocently or ignorantly, in this system of waste and exploitation.
So movements like slow food, they're pushing back against that.
Exactly. They're framed as an ethical counter-movement. They champion the idea of food being connected to a specific place, grown and prepared with care. Eating locally, seasonally, knowing your producer, it fosters this social connection that demands transparency and accountability in a way that buying an anonymous, globally sourced industrial product just can't.
Transparency seems key. Consumers need to know what they're actually buying and supporting. It reminds me of those early food safety battles, like with Dr. Wiley.
Absolutely. Back then, companies were caught selling things labeled fruit syrups that were basically just alcohol, glycerin, artificial colors derived from coal tar, maybe some cheap saccharin for sweetness, and barely any actual fruit or expensive sugar. The public outrage when that became known was immense, and it led to demands for labeling and regulation.
So the challenge today is similar, maybe just more sophisticated. Less outright poison, more subtle manipulation through SFS and processing.
You could argue that. And the consumer's role in demanding change is just as critical now as it was then. The desire for better options, local, sustainable, whole foods, seems to be growing naturally. But for that desire to translate into real change, the system itself needs to adapt. That means supporting farmers markets, CSAs, innovative small producers, but also, crucially, tackling the policy barriers. Those massive subsidies that overwhelmingly favor the giant commodity operations and make it so hard for alternatives to compete.
So the ultimate ethical goal is shifting the food culture itself, moving away from just valuing cheapness and convenience towards valuing quality, connection, and demanding accountability from the huge players who shape the system. Hashtag tag outro. We're starting this deep dive trying to understand the architecture of our modern diet, and what we found is a story that stretches back more than 5 centuries. We found that the very definition of what tastes good, what's palatable, was shaped by the often brutal economics of empire. Salt and sugar weren't just ingredients. They defined trade routes, fueled slavery, and laid the groundwork for corporate giants to perfect the art of delivering calories cheaply and efficiently.
Yeah, the main takeaway seems really clear. The primary goal of the industrial food system, as dictated by the economic model we've traced, isn't necessarily maximum nutrition. It's not even really maximum flavor complexity in a culinary sense. It's maximum palatability, delivered by that cheap, effective SFS combination, coupled with maximum profit margins and maximum shelf life. And achieving that priority allows corporations to dominate markets and maintain a global scope that, as the sources suggest, really does echo those empires of the past.
We spent a good bit of time looking at the consequences, particularly how policy choices, like those massive subsidies for commodity crops, end up favoring the huge players over smaller independent farmers. This drives consolidation, leads to environmental pressures, and creates these absurd economic situations, like milk becoming cheaper than bottled water, forcing farmers into unsustainable practices just to survive. So here's something to think about. If we want a food system that's actually rooted in transparency and health and ethical production, should our first move be tackling those core policy decisions, those subsidies that prop up the enormous scale of the SFS supply chain? Instead of just focusing on mitigating the health problems that system creates downstream, that's definitely something for you to chew on until our next deep dive.